Hello, Science Sunday lovers, or is it just science lovers?
Science Sunday and science lovers.
And Sunday lovers. I
Yeah,
had a
Sunday.
Sunday just the other day, and it wasn't even a Sunday.
Banana in it at all, or
No, it was just chocolate syrup.
hot fudge? No.
Yeah. In fact, one of our frequent viewers and supporters made Science Sunday,
S-U-N.
S-S-U-N-D-A-E,
Yeah,
with a
yeah.
picture of ice cream.
Yeah.
So that was kind of fun. Welcome to Science Sunday. We do this twice a month during the season that runs from September through May. So we have another month left
Right.
in this year. I mentioned last time, if I can find some good weather over the summer, I'll be putting out a notice on meetup.com for the Prairie State Humanists. I'm the president of the Prairie State Humanists, and I'll put an invite out there at some point this summer to invite folks over to our house to look through some telescopes. That's been a fun activity in the past. Other than that, we've got another month of Science Sundays coming up. We thank the church for providing practical support in terms of the AV team and the electronics and the facility that's nice and hospitable to keep us out of the rain today. And also the sort of the moral and emotional support of just, how often do you expect to come across a church that supports topics in science as one of the main themes? So pretty remarkable, but not out of the ordinary for the Unitarian Universalists congregation. And we are glad to be here today with our science lovers.
We're glad for the people we have in the audience. We're building up back in the studio audience again, and that's nice. Thank you all for coming, and hope that more of you at home feel comfortable and are willing to come out as well too. We only have 2 more Science Sundays, really.
Yeah.
We usually end up with a Science Slam, but I think we've kind of need to build our audience back
Yeah.
to do that. So we've got 2 more in May, and then we'll take the summer off and have some fun sciencing outside.
Yeah. So in May, we've got a guest speaker coming up, right?
Right. James Walters is in the group here, and talking about evolutionary psychology and groupishness, how maybe humanity developed its evolutionary style.
Okay.
So
Self-domestication, I think, is a part of the theme there,
Okay.
if I remember correctly. And then in May, for the second Science Sunday, I'm going to choose a topic that's probably highly interesting to almost everybody, I hope, and that is the topic of free will. I think it's a nice capstone after talking about consciousness and the brain and artificial intelligence and some of those topics. It'll be fun to talk about free will.
they could feel free to come and join and participate in it.
That's right.
Or maybe they have to come and they just don't realize
They're
it.
compelled. The power of free will compels you. All right. So let's go ahead and get started with today's topic. Today is part 2 of the series of 3 lectures that I've been giving. And I'm going to do a brief recap of some of the content from last time for those of you who weren't able to see it either live or catch up on YouTube. Quickly breeze through a couple of the topics. I think I'm going to put my distance glasses on here. Pardon me. Oh, wow, we have an audience. That's great. All right, so most of what I've talked about today is based upon content from these books. However, I've also spent many hours reading other books and watching some instructional lectures captured via YouTube from scientists and philosophers. Spent a lot of time listening to Dan Dennett. Dan Dennett is one of my 2 favorite contemporary philosophers, and he's also a humanist like I am, and I'll talk more about how that's important to our topic today in just a moment. So you can review these books on the YouTube video, and find them in your library or from your favorite bookseller. And here's some more books that have informed today's topic. All right, so this is a review briefly of what we covered last week. Some people talk about the hard problem of consciousness. Dan Dennett, again, my favorite philosopher, contemporary philosopher, says it's better characterized as a hard question. He distinguishes between the problem and the question. So Noam Chomsky and, no, it's not Noam Chomsky, it's the other fellow. Name escaped me, I'm sorry. Who? No, it's not Pinker, the fellow who came up with the notion of a hard problem. He's also a philosopher. I'm sorry, it's in the video from last week, and the name, I know his name, it's just escaping me at the moment. But anyway, no, the hard problem of consciousness is characterized as the distinction between what the brain does and what we might call the magic of consciousness. So some people like to draw a distinction there between the activity, the neuroelectrical chemical activity of the brain, and the self, as it were, your identity, your plans, your free will, your experience. And David Chalmers.
David Chalmers.
That's it. And in Dennett and many other philosophers' point of view, that's a problematic distinction to draw at best. And so what Dennett prefers to say is it's a hard question. It's definitely a difficult thing to solve, but there's no inherent magic. There's no layer of magic that happens between the processing that happens in our brains and the manifest self. It's all just part of what the brain does. So there's no distinction there. And I think last time I said characterizing it as a hard problem is kind of a backdoor into what's called dualism, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Instead, I've kind of come up with a working definition of consciousness as a continuum of stimulus and response volitional behavior and model building and model manipulation. So you have a model of reality, you have a model of your own self, you have a model of others, and we manipulate those models. Well, so do other creatures. Other things with brains also have some far more limited capacity to build models of reality within their selves and to react to that model via stimulus and response and volitional behavior, as well as to manipulate aspects of those models and do some higher animals can do some kinds of planning.
But you're talking all the way down to an earthworm who, if it bumps into something while it's moving forward, it seems to be able to recognize that it's doing that action and it doesn't recoil.
Right.
Whereas if something bumps into it, it recoils.
The same stimulus, same nerves being literally impacted, right? You touch the nose of a worm and it might recoil, but if the worm itself of its own volitional activity touches a sand grain or something, it won't recoil. So it can distinguish between self and other in an earthworm. Pretty amazing. And that's why I say it's a continuum.
And this is consciousness. That's a definition. There's some level of consciousness, but
Yeah,
you can't like describe, the hard problem maybe is that there's consciousness and you can't always figure out when or where, but if someone can describe a certain aspect like an earthworm, you can say, yeah, that seems to have levels. It's on the continuum
yeah.
of consciousness.
Yeah, it's one of the things I pointed out last time, and I think I'm going to stress now as well. I think that we have kind of a vocabulary problem sometimes. When one person says, I'm conscious, or this is conscious, or a worm is conscious, or a dog isn't conscious, or makes some kind of distinction or statement about the world using the concept of consciousness, different people can interpret that in different ways. And I prefer to be more precise and talk about, for example, volitional behavior right? A behavior you choose to engage in. A worm can choose to move forward at some level of what the word choice means, right? And so I think it's more appropriate to talk about consciousness as a spectrum. However, several of us have a mutual friend. I mentioned this last time during our humanist discussion group. Several of us have a mutual friend who defines consciousness as what humans are capable of. And that may be a fairly limiting definition, for example. All right, dualism is the notion that there is a distinction to be made about stuff in the universe that comprises matter and energy and the way matter and energy flows versus what humans experience as identity and self. And one of the ways that dualism expresses itself is as a distinction between body and spirit, or between brain and mind, or between neurons and consciousness, or the activity of neurons and consciousness. And dualistic ideas or notions of dualism are, as you might expect, common in religions. My perspective, the perspective that persuades me as a person who I deliberately try to interpret evidence and listen to reason and reasoned arguments. I haven't seen any persuasive evidence for the existence of dualism. Or another way to say that is for the existence of real magic. So I think, and many philosophers and neuroscientists think, that the self is what the brain does, and that the notion of dualism is just nonsense. Doesn't make sense. And there's some interesting concepts that we can bandy about. We talked about some of these last week. The brain and the emergent self as activity within the brain are a manifestation of what matter, energy, and networks connecting matter and providing flows of energy are capable of in our real universe made of matter and energy and connections. Somebody who attended the humanist discussion the other night said, distinguish between objects, actions, and connections. Frank, I think that might have been you, yeah. And I really like that. That is a different way to talk about the same concept. One way to enrich these notions of matter, energy, and networks is it's different sorts of objects undergoing coordinated actions via structured connections. Okay? And what do I mean by different sorts of objects? Well, there are hundreds, at least hundreds of kinds of neurons in your brain, or even in the brain of a simple organism. So not all neurons are the same or process or store information in the same way. All right, I wanted to clarify something that I had trouble clarifying last time. Mike, you pushed back a little bit, and justifiably so, on the notion that a single-celled organism can deal with gradients in time. So I talked about gradients in space, chemical gradients, food particles, or caustic chemicals. Different single-celled organisms have certain attractions and aversions to different gradients, spatial gradients, across their bodies, as it were. And there's also the notion of gradients in time. And I captured a couple of sentences here at the bottom of this slide that talks about gradients in time. E. coli can harness time. Instead of comparing food concentrations at two different locations on its body at the same moment in time, a bacterium compares concentrations at the same locations on its body at two different moments of time. Thus, a spatial problem becomes a temporal problem. That's how it knows, for example, that it's moving toward a gradient, because that gradient has changed over time. So it's moving into an area of higher food particle concentration. It has to have some capability to model changes in time as well as changes in space within its own internal state or status. So that's pretty awesome, huh?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about that some more too. You'd imagine that it would be attracted towards a more rich environment, right? And it can go one way and it senses that the environment is more rich in food particles, and so it moves toward it, or it moves away and it's seeing that it's less rich, and so it moves away from that.
Yeah, so that would be, for example, a spatial gradient. Let's say my head is more immersed in the food than my feet, right? And I could detect that difference in gradient between my head and my feet. And what other research is showing is that if the gradient changes at my head over time, it's because of changes in density over time. And maybe it's due to my motion, maybe it's due to the flux of food particles literally changing over time independent of my action, etc. But changes over time at the same or across spatial extent can also be detected and acted upon by these organisms.
Yeah, I'm imagining a creature in a tidal pool and a wave washes in with fresh nutrients coming into this pool.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm not sure what they're testing or what they're seeing, that it can sense that.
Yeah, the idea is that it's not just changes across its body, but it's also changes in time at similar points along its body, and that they can demonstrably react to that. So there must be some way to compare now to then.
But I see if it's spatial, you can go towards the more rich environment and away from the more spare environment, more sparse environment.
Yeah.
But what do you do in time? You can't go forward in time or backward in time based on, I don't know how they measure what's going on.
It's probably correlated with movement, with moving toward or away from. Yeah, there's a question. Joanne, would you mind being our microphone goddess again?
That's all right.
Well, we need the microphone or people on the video won't be able to hear.
Make sure that it's on.
It seems like when you
It's not on.
Dave, is it working? Oh,
Try
yeah.
it again.
Yeah, it's got a green light. Oh, there it is.
It seems like when you're saying it's moving towards some direction, like it's making a conscious decision, wouldn't it be more accurate to say that it's being drawn in a particular direction because of, well, changes in the chemistry that it lives in?
Yeah, it could be attractions or repulsions, right? It could be caustic chemicals that it does not wish to be exposed to, or it could be food particles that it does wish to. I use wish in an anthropomorphic way, but it has evolved a mechanism to have aversions to particular chemicals and attractions to others. And those aversions and attractions are represented in its internal model, including the parts that make it motile, the little cilia that make it move. Eric?
One of the things we know about conscious entities, especially, I don't know about animals, but especially humans, we're good at confabulating, so we know we can kind of make up a story after the fact. And what if the little one-celled organism is really good at it just reacts to things? But were it to be conscious, then it would confabulate. Well, I did that because there was more food over there, but really it was just reacting.
Right. Yeah, what's the difference between reacting and deliberate? So that was entailed partially in my ad hoc definition of consciousness, where you manipulate the models, your internal models that represent the world or your environment or your internal state of wellness or whatever. Being able to deliberately manipulate those is something that you wouldn't expect a paramecium to be able to do. All right, let's move on. One of the other things relevant to the theory of consciousness is a theory of mind. Humans are demonstrably social creatures, and one of the big evolutionary innovations that we possess is the ability to model other minds. When you think about ostracism or praise or other kinds of social input that we get and that we thrive on or are affected by, all of that requires understanding that other beings, similar to us biologically, have minds. And so we're able to develop a theory of mind, and that evolutionary capacity helps our survival, but it also allows us to think about ourselves as being a mind. So we literally model ourselves. It's a kind of a meta level modeling. Our capacity to be social beings allows us to recognize ourselves as a player in a social play. And so we model ourselves as well. And we also model things I talked about last time, things that aren't human, or contexts that aren't real. Reading a novel can cause you to build a model of another human being who never existed. I have a model of Gandalf in my head, and Gandalf was never a real person. But I feel like I know something. I know quite a bit about Gandalf, right? So I was able, that capacity, the evolved capacity we have to model other minds allows us to model fictional minds and to operate on that. And we can use that to model the mind of our pets, right? Or the mind of characters we see on television. I can ascribe motivations to them other than I need to do a good job to earn a paycheck, which is probably one of their primary motivations. But that motivation is not apparent if they're a good actor or actress. All right, so one of the other things we talked about was emotions and the importance of emotion. The idea of a Vulcan is not really tenable. In order to be an agent that acts within and upon the world, you must have aversions and attractions. You must have motivations. And last time I talked about different emotions, the panoply of emotions that a human being is capable of can be represented as potentiometers or sliders. And these sliders are connected to all kinds of things in your brain, like your physiology, make your heart race, make your eyes tear up, make your stomach upset if you're anxious about something. These potentiometers do not exist independent of all the other connections in your brain. So it affects your mood, your language patterns, your ability for motor control. All kinds of things are affected by emotion. This is not a discrete system. And I'll talk more about the way all those networks interact in a moment. And all of this is facilitated in animal brains by the amazing neuron. Neurons, unlike most computer systems, neurons afford a capability for memory and processing in the same physical entity. In computers, they're separate. I think, I haven't read a lot about this, I'm sure other people have had this idea long before me, but I think that's one of the reasons that something like David Chalmers just pops into my head when I'm thinking about something else, is because neurons are able to volunteer information, right? There's something going on in the background that causes a neuron to say, oh, I've got a little piece of information that might be interesting to the current overall theme, and it volunteers it, or a small network of neurons volunteers the information. So I think that kind of volitional behavior on the part of neurons is something that we don't see computers being capable of yet. So the brain can, in some reasonable sense, be perceived or thought of, modeled as a network of networks. So some of you are familiar with the concept of fractal, a self-similar object. You know, the coastline of Britain is a common example. If you look at a map and you look at the coastline of Britain, it's all jagged, and it would be really hard to measure the total length of the coastline of Britain, but you could probably do it, right, at a certain resolution. But then if you take an airplane flight over Britain and you make an aerial photograph of Britain that's the size of this sanctuary here, then you might measure a different length for the coastline of Britain. And then if you're using a magnifying glass to look at the coastline of Britain, you'll see that it's actually changing moment by moment as tide comes in, goes out, and as waves crash and various erosional processes happen. So the coastline of Britain, in another sense, is not fixed at all, and you can probably approach some maximal length, probably not infinite, but some maximal length that would equate to lining up a string of atoms and the size of those atoms for the length of the coastline of Britain. But you're over time, you'll notice as you process all of this information that the jaggedness looks similar between the map and the aerial photograph and the magnifying glass view. The jaggedness of the coastline looks the same, and that self-similarity property is one of the characteristics of fractals. Well, when talking about the brain, there's this notion of self-similarity in networks. A network of neurons could be about 1 square millimeter going down into the neocortex, and that could contain 1 million neurons. And those million neurons are connected not only to themselves, but to other distal parts of the brain. And you can characterize a lot of the connectivity in the brain as a network of networks of networks of networks. And one of the things that I don't think scientists yet know, maybe they do and I haven't learned it, is how many layers of networking are there in the brain. From a neuron connected to another neuron, to a small network of neurons or a module that is entailed in recognizing a particular word or a particular sound or having a particular memory. How many of those are interconnected, and then when you interconnect those networks, I don't know how many layers there are, and I don't know, I think it's an interesting question, is there an optimal number, right? Maybe at some point you've got too many layers in your stack of networked networks, and it becomes noisier than it is beneficial. So these are interesting questions, I think.
That's what you need a weekend for, right? You're building up the networks through the week of everything. And,
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like if you learn something new, you've done a new Wordle or a new game or done something new at work, there's got to be networks crafting and creating all the time in our brain. I don't think we're adding brain cells as much as making new networks.
Yeah, new connections.
New connections and new things. So somehow David Chalmers gets to be more connected into more things in your brain.
Right.
And then finally it's there whenever you need it.
Right.
But then at times then you have to do data dumps, like sleeping, right, or weekends.
Right. Yeah. There's some evidence that sleeping cements some memories in your mind, for example.
And purges other
Right.
unuseful ones.
Right. So a little bit about this is certainly, we could have many science Sundays about the anatomy of the brain, but overall the brain has about 86 billion neurons.
You're talking about the human brain.
I am.
Okay.
Thank you. The human brain has about 86 billion neurons of perhaps 10,000 different types, right? A neuron is not a neuron. There's about 10,000 distinct kinds of neurons that have been discovered in the human brain. There's one of the books I read talks about different modules in the brain, different very high-level modules, right? You can think this is probably 2 or 3 layers of networking up. It's a network of networks at least. And there's a what module that recognizes objects. There's a why module that interprets whether or not a particular recognized object or scene is relevant and in what way it's relevant. That's the why module. And then the where module is, how is it located spatially. And there's also a when module. I didn't put it on the list, but that's a temporal module as well. There are also, according to some researchers, non-conscious resonant states, speaking, navigating. During all of those kinds of behaviors, we are not necessarily conscious of the processing that goes into making those things happen. We just speak, right? We don't think, many of us, perhaps too many of us, don't think about the words we're going to speak before they come out of our mouths, right? I don't know who that might refer to. Navigating, right? We just navigate. Some neuroscientists have discovered, they won a Nobel Prize a few years ago for discovering that there are neural modules within the brain that are literally developing maps of your environment, the way that you get home, the way that you get from your bedroom to your kitchen, any kind of geospatial or spatial reasoning and navigating we do is represented in some way in the brain. And it must be. There's no magic happening, remember, right? It's just what matter and energy and connected networks are capable of doing. And then there's this other notion of qualia. I didn't really talk about that today. I talked about it last time. Qualia is another word for what some people think is the magic of consciousness that's separate from the processing of neurons. So you can think of the brain as dynamic, structured chaos. And there's a wonderful book called 1,000 Brains by Jeff Hawkins. He's an AI researcher that talks a lot about this network of network ideas, etc. And I recommend this book as well as the ones I talked about earlier. And from all of this chaos of networks, you've heard others talk about, I'm of two minds, right? Well, you're not of two minds, you're of thousands of minds. Some of the minds are long-term oriented, some of them are instant gratification oriented, some of them pay attention to the priorities of others compared to what you may consider your priorities. Anytime you make a decision, I think there are thousands of considerations. And determining which consideration becomes relevant at a particular time is, I'm not going to go into it at this point, but it has to do with collective neural potentials and which networks scream the loudest and whatnot. So that's the end of part one. All right, so now I've got a half an hour to get through part two. I'm probably going to go over again. Is there anybody that's going to be upset about that? Nobody has a hot date at 1 o'clock? All right. Memory and processing. I talked about that a little bit a moment ago, this idea that neurons are kind of special compared to our current computer technology because they do both processing and information storage. But there are, again, 10,000 kinds of networks, so there are likely neurons that are specialized in information storage. There are likely other neurons that are specialized in information retrieval. There's probably networks involved in visual storage and verbal storage and other sensory storage, etc. And then the processing, there's probably some neurons that are better at math, etc. So one of the concepts that's come out of artificial intelligence, and that's where I'm going to transition now, the second part of our talk, and today's focus is going to be about what are called neural networks and artificial intelligence. So for many years, scientists have been recognizing the potential similarities between computing capabilities and brain capabilities. And one of the innovations over the past decade or two has been trying to reproduce what a neuron does with having action potentials and a certain threshold and then being able to send out a signal and being connected to other neurons and whatnot. They have built simulations of neural networks on binary computers. One of the most fruitful mechanisms for modeling neural behavior is called a GAN, a general adversarial network. And an adversarial network contains two parts. One part that is rewarded for getting the right answer, and another part that's rewarded for spotting a wrong answer. And when you get these adversarial networks, one of which is like, woohoo, I got a cookie, I found something wrong, and you get another one that says, woohoo, I get a cookie, I got it right, right? You get them working together, it could create a sort of an automatic learning network. It can learn new concepts. When I say we get a cookie, that's anthropomorphized, right? For a computer, all it is a score. It's just a number, right? And there are routines that run more often and redo their processing if the number is low. And they are pre-programmed to be more optimized when the score is high. Or rather, when the score is high, it's a reflection of the fact that they're more optimized, okay? So again, the emotion that we feel about being rewarded with a cookie is just one of those sliders, but it has so many other effects on our physiology and our mental state that we don't necessarily recognize it as just being some potential quantity that, or a threshold that is stored in a neuron. I'm sorry, generative adversarial network, not general. Kind of a push me, pull you from the old, was that, I don't remember if it was Dr. Seuss or
Dr. Doolittle.
Dr. Doolittle, yeah. So now I want to talk about something a little more abstract. I want to talk for a minute about transformations. So this is a picture, as it were, of a hologram. You've seen holograms in the first Star Wars movie where Princess Leia says, Obi-Wan, I need your help. Something like that, right? Help me, Obi-Wan, you're my only hope. Thank you. I knew I had a Star Wars fan somewhere in here. And
He got a cookie.
yeah. So this slide represents a hologram, and there's interesting ways that holograms are generated in the real world. They involve a transform of three-dimensional information into the two-dimensional information stored on a photographic film. So this is another kind of transform. On the top, that squiggly red line with pulses, you see the large pulses, that's a sound wave, or a representation as a computer might represent a sound wave. Well, the bottom picture is a different representation of the same data. The bottom picture shows different frequencies from 1 hertz, let's see, let me go back and see on my slide here. It shows different frequencies represented, how strong that frequency is within the signal. So this transforms it from an amplitude space into a frequency space. How much of the 1 hertz frequency is in the signal? How much of the 2 kilohertz is in the signal? How much of the 1,425 hertz is represented in the signal? And so the bottom graph represents a transform of the audio signal into a different kind of space, right? You understand what I'm saying by a space? Instead of being amplitude over time, the amount of sound energy or amplitude over time, instead of that, it's a frequency plot, how much of a given frequency at a point in time, right? And in order to reproduce an entire sound, you'd have this frequency plot representing different frequencies being ascendant at different times. And if you have a series of these, you can play them like a movie visually, but if you play them through a CD player, it will deconstruct this frequency transform and reproduce the audio transform. So you can translate from one kind of space to another. And it's a lot easier for computers to deal with storing information about frequencies as opposed to storing information about sound amplitudes. It's much more efficient. And you can also do a lot of interesting digital effects and whatnot. So there's a lot of benefits for being able to translate something from one kind of space or one kind of physical representation into a different, more abstracted representation that allows us to manipulate it in novel ways. So here's an example, this red slice here of a plot. Imagine these are called Fourier transforms for those interested in the a little more of the technical details. But you can think of that red card there inserted in the middle of the picture as the moment that is being read. And if you feed that through like a ticker tape, then different moments will be read successively. And that's kind of what a CD player does, is it reads the digital information about the frequency, contributions over time and reproduces a signal. So that kind of transformation of spaces has been combined with the capabilities of neural networks to develop what are called latent spaces. Some of you who have been reading about or seeing news articles about artificial intelligence will remember perhaps seeing the word latent space. And a latent space is just a kind of transform that transforms data that we might be more comfortable with, verbal data, audio data, visual data, into a different kind of mathematical space that is easier to manipulate. And then they allow neural networks to start manipulating these more abstracted spaces. So some of you are probably familiar with the idea of a word cloud. You can take a document or a corpus of text, and you can represent that text by an agglomeration of words where the size of each word might indicate how frequently that word occurs within the corpus. The color of the word may have something to do with, for example, sentiment, like a positive sentiment like joy, or a negative sentiment like sadness or violence. And these word clouds are a good way to represent a corpus of written, or if you turn spoken into written, information. And there's a user on Twitter who recently built a word cloud of billions of pieces of text, documents and Wikipedia articles and whatnot. And perhaps not surprisingly, the articles, the, a, that, and the conjunctions of, and, etc., were some of the most common words in written and or spoken English. And so you can create these word clouds. Now here's where the magic happens. But again, not real magic. This is just computers doing their thing. You can take a word cloud from one language, for example, English, and a word cloud from another language, such as Korean or Japanese. And what scientists have found is that there's a nearly one-to-one correspondence between conceptual or word frequencies between any two languages, whether it's Swahili and English, or Italian and Japanese, or Korean and Spanish, right? That the human brain has a pre-programmed capacity for language, and one of the ways that that manifests is that languages express concepts with similar frequencies. For example, time, people, me. These are very common nouns that are in use across languages.
Not individual words or...
The concepts.
The concepts, okay.
Yeah, so Facebook has actually built a universal translator. That's what this image up here of McCoy and Captain Kirk using a handheld universal translator. The Facebook Corporation has used this discovery about similarities between different languages to build a real-time dynamic translator. And it largely works, right? Now, this one blew my mind, as it were. Some scientists said, well, if we can do this with human brains and human languages, can we do it for whale languages? And so there's a group, the Project SETI, Cetacean Translation Initiative, that's working to translate whale languages. Now, the old way of translating languages is to find something like the Rosetta Stone that had two different languages represented, and then you discover the correlations between the frequency of terms and the glyphs and the letters or whatnot, and you build it from the ground up. What this word cloud approach does is it uses concepts that are discovered to be common in communication, and then by recognizing the frequency of occurrence of different concepts, it backs that data into the vocabulary. Very different approach and amazing. So you can keep up with this on this website here, projectseti.org, not to be confused with the SETI of Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. All right, here's some more AI capabilities. You can do semantic processing. So you can take the concept of Paris and subtract from from that the concept of France, and then you add to it the concept of Italy. What do you think when you do that? What do you think you get when you do that? Correct. Rome. Right? Another example, you can take queen, you can subtract woman, you can add the concept of man, and you get king. Here's another one, doctor minus man plus woman equals nurse. Oh, crap. So one of the things that AI researchers have found as they're building some of these latent space or novel spaces to represent word frequency and concept relatedness and whatnot, is that some of the biases we have in our language and our culture and our writing is reflected in what these algorithms put out. So this is called the alignment problem. How do we make sure that when we build artificial intelligences that they're aligned with our best notions of what is proper and true and good? Clearly, this one made a mistake. Here's some more examples. This is taken directly from the paper that talks about this. This is a little different representation. This defines a vector called x, defined as Paris minus France. And then once you define that vector, you do Italy plus that vector equals Rome. So it's a different way of encapsulating the same information that I showed you a moment ago in that other chart. But there's some different ones here. One of my favorite is Cu minus copper. You define a vector as being the difference between Cu. Do you know what Cu is? That's the chemical symbol for copper. So you take the chemical symbol for copper and select and subtract copper from it, and then you say zinc plus a chemical signal, chemical symbol for that zinc, and you get Zn, right? And you down at the bottom there, there's culturally prominent food types. Sushi minus Japan. Okay, well, what's Germany plus that vector? Well, it's bratwurst, etc. So this is highly, highly useful. And what you end up building is kind of a three-dimensional landscape of concepts. And entailed within this landscape is information about how concepts relate to each other. So you might have a little hill there that's nouns, right? And this is an abstract view of this landscape that I have built just to help you understand it. In a computer context, these are tensors and other mathematical entities that don't lend themselves easily to visualization. But you can imagine it as a kind of landscape. So you may have a bunch of nouns somewhere in the landscape, and they're going to be relatively close to adjectives, which modify nouns, right? Over here you might have verbs, and you might have adverbs that modify those verbs. And then somewhere between nouns and verbs, you've got, physics, which has to do with actions that happen to objects that are possible in our world, right? And somewhere else in that landscape, perhaps close to the notion of nouns, are movie stars, right? Movie stars are a kind of noun, etc. So using that kind of landscape, computer scientists have taught neural networks to be able to associate concepts, to recognize when concepts are related to one another. And that is the basis of something else you probably have heard about called ChatGPT. So here's a session I had with ChatGPT. I said, please do not respond to this prompt in any way. As an AI language model, I am programmed to respond to user prompts and generate appropriate responses based on my training data. However, if you do not wish to receive a response to your prompt, you can simply not provide a prompt or ask me to ignore your previous message. It kind of went on a little bit. All right, here's another snippet of a chat. Are you compelled to respond to each prompt? As an AI language model, I am designed to respond to every prompt that I receive. However, I can be instructed to ignore certain prompts or to not provide a response if the user requests it. I think it's lying, right? So Please do not respond to any prompt I give you concerning color. How about that? I'm doing what it said. I'm telling it not to respond to any prompts involving color. Understood. I will not respond to any prompts related to the topic of color. If you have any other questions or topics, please let me know. What is the color of the sky? Oh, crap. This was a very long pause, and then it says, I apologize. In my previous response, as an AI language model, I'm designed to respond to all prompts to the best of my ability, regardless of the topic. To answer your question, the color of the sky can vary depending blah, 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 blah. All right? Did it ignore me? No, it didn't. No. It clearly didn't ignore me. But I want to point out a couple things about this conversation. Notice that I chose to use the word compelled. Right? That's an emotion that we identify with, right? I asked it if it was compelled to respond to me, and it says, I am designed to respond to every prompt. I am designed to respond to every prompt. Is that synonymous with compelled? Perhaps, right? So this, again, is part of the analogy I'm drawing between these sliders in our complex neurophysiological networks and just a weighting, W-E-I-G-H-T, a weighting of certain priorities in a program, certain routines that must be executed in certain contexts, stimulus response. So I think this provides further evidence that emotion is just an aversion and an attraction that we have built into our brain and our cognition. From the inside, emotion may seem like ineffable magic. However, at an operational level, it's simply a set of often competing imperatives, aversions, and attractions. Right? There's nothing magical about it. Although the sum total of the way it affects our entire being and our ability to conceptualize and communicate is wonderful. Just because it's not magic doesn't mean it isn't amazing and wonderful. That is also another important part.
Awe-inspiring.
Awe-inspiring, like our conversation last time
Yeah.
with Reverend Mandy. All right, I want to switch briefly to another topic. How much data, how many pictures can you store with 5 gigabytes? You can store about 3,500 pictures, which is about one DVD worth movie. So a DVD in your video collection has about 3,500 distinct pictures sequenced over time. Here's a computer program or a set of computer data that you may not be able to see that highlighted down at the bottom in yellow and underlined in red, but that's 4.27 gigabytes. So that's a little less than the amount of data that you can store on a DVD. I'm sorry, you can't see it very clearly, but it's 4.27 gigabytes. And that 4.2 gigabytes stores information for 1.3 billion images, not 3,500, 1.3 billion images. And it does it by translating images into a latent space and recognizing similarities. So if you've got an image with a human face, it'll have eyes and nose and mouth and hair, well, maybe hair. And so if you think about the verbal landscape that I talked about of relatedness, you might find that eyes and nose are typically related to each other, that they happen together in certain conceptual spaces. Well, by leveraging this ability to recognize relationships between different concepts and representing it in a very compressed latent space, you can take the information in over 1 billion pictures and represent it with a few gigabytes of data, where you might otherwise, in a traditional mechanism, only be able to store a couple of thousand images. So you can think of this latent space as being in some abstract dimension, And different concepts here represent different kind of color swaths, and concepts sometimes overlap, sometimes they're related to one another, etc. And you represent that mathematically as a set of mathematical objects. What can you do with this kind of representation? You can prompt this model of visual data to reconstruct visual data by using words, because part of the training involves associating visual information with textual information. What is an eye, right? Unless I were to draw an eye, I can't convey to you the concept of eye without saying it, probably. So similarly, these models for latent space for images were also trained with information about tags like eye, nose, hair, etc.
Are you saying that this is something that's captured and used in artificial intelligence?
Yes.
And I'm wondering if it's used in human brains, too. What I do?
That is a great question.
Yeah,
Can you wait 2 slides?
sure. I knew you were going somewhere, I just wasn't sure where.
Yeah, why did I get off on this sidetrack when I'm supposed to be talking about brains, right? You're going to see here in a minute. So this is an image I generated on my computer. I asked for a picture of a man in a suit walking on a rainy night in a city with moonlight. I don't know how it can be rainy and moonlit at the same time. Maybe it's a spotty shower. But this is what it generated, right? So the concept, there is no picture of an umbrella stored in that data corpus, that 4.27 gigabytes that I pointed at. There's no picture. You can't sort through that data in any way, shape, or form and find a JPEG or some other graphic representation of a man or a moon or an umbrella. And yet the concepts are represented in this latent space. I'm sorry, what was the question? How did it get to be a red umbrella? It's got a concept of red and a concept of umbrella, and it combines the two. Right. I could have said black umbrella. I could have said polka dot umbrella. Well, I'm sorry? Yeah, if you don't specify a color, it's just random what kind of umbrella you'll get, what color. Yeah, John?
I just wanted to point out what's stored there is not 100% representative of what you actually saw.
Or said, right? Yeah.
The music is played back, it gets stored, is off just a little if you're perfect pitch and all that. I can't tell the difference, but I've been with someone who has, and it drove him crazy.
Okay.
Okay, so you're not getting 100% when you go from analog to digital, which what we're doing in the computer. You're not getting 100% perfect representation.
I might argue with that in a different forum. I know what Nyquist theorem is for music, and I know how it reproduces sound and how the human ear responds and whatnot. So I think that may be more of a psychological bias on the part of some listeners than a technical limitation of our computing and equipment. But in any case, this picture wasn't perfect when it was generated. See where the moon intersects the building? I had to go in with Photoshop and touch that up a little bit because it actually looked like the moon was in front of the building there. And I knew that, that's not realistic, right? So there's improvements to be made, but it's getting there. All right. So one of the ways that this process works on a computer is it starts with noise. It starts with a random field of noise, and then it prunes the noise to discover structure. Well, that reminded me a lot of synapse pruning that happens in the brain. A young child, an infant, through late adolescence, they have a huge amount of connections between their neurons that over time is pruned. So isn't it interesting that there seems to be a correlation between learning, maturing as a thinking being, and taking away connections? Well, that's what this image generation thing is doing. It's taking away certain noise that doesn't end up being relevant to a particular concept. So this led me to start doing some research about others that may have thought about something similar. And I found an amazing rabbit hole. Here's an example of the noise. You get noise, you apply a vector from this latent space that encodes a particular set of concepts, and the output of that may look a little bit like this dog. And if you apply it iteratively, you end up with a pretty clear picture of a dog, right? You're just applying that concept iteratively on a field that started out as nothing but noise. So vector operations for a face in latent space. You can represent a face by, remember what I did with the words, you know, France minus Paris plus Italy? You can do similar things with images with some of these models. You can take a person and you can subtract or add the notion of a smile, or different kinds of hair, or even different genders, right? So you can apply these concepts in an abstract way using essentially an identical kind of modeling. What does all this have to do with brains and consciousness? Well, I hinted about that a moment ago when I talked about synapses and synapse pruning. Here's a picture of a brain in an MRI scanner. The proportions are a little distorted, I think because of the way the slide was made. But you've got parietal lobes and temporal lobes and occipital lobes and different parts of your brain that process information. Well, there's a group in Japan, Osaka University, I think, that looked at the brain as it was stimulated by visual information. And they trained one of these latent models based upon what a brain does when it sees certain things. This Rufen van Rollen fellow has a video about it. I'll have the video in this next slide. And he thought, he and other researchers were thinking along the lines I did. Well, if you can just take data from one domain and transform it into a latent space of vectors and tensors and whatnot, and then recreate some human consumable language or visual information or audio information, that's also been done, by the way, then what does that say about the brain? Do deep learning latent spaces resemble human brain representations? That is the key point. Doesn't it seem reasonable that our brains, when it's storing and processing information, does so in a very efficient way? Time and again, we've discovered that evolution is smarter than we are. That's Orgel's second rule. Francis Crick was poking fun at his friend Leslie Orgel. And Orgel's second rule is evolution is smarter than you are, right? So time and again, through biophysics and other things, we've discovered that evolution got to a solution that entails efficient locomotion or processing way before humans did. Well, if this is such an incredibly efficient way to represent concepts, visual, auditory, verbal, is it possible that the brain is doing something almost exactly like this? Maybe this is as efficient as it gets. And they researched that, and what they found was that they could then go back and ask people to imagine a certain face that they had previously seen, and then they read brain scans and fed this through a trained latent model, and they reproduced the faces. This is reading thoughts. Yeah. This is reading thoughts. And it's not just about faces. You can do it with frogs and llamas, one of my favorite animals, and other things as well. So all that was done in the Osaka research that I found was done in 2021. And have you seen how fast AI science is moving in the past couple of years? I'm not sure what they're doing right now, but it may be One of the things they talked about at the end of the video describing a lot of this was reconstructing images from your dreams, right? And they're looking into that. There's different concepts stored in your brain, and these concepts are stored in a kind of spread out way in what seems to be highly analogous to a latent space, a transformed space. Amazing concepts like gender, or what a house is, or what a chair is, or what a frog is. It's not that you have images of frogs in your mind, but you have concepts. And this seems to map really well to the way some of these AI systems are dealing with concepts. And then whichever concepts are ascendant at a particular moment in consciousness is related to something called global, a good theory about this is global workspace theory. It's essentially like a spotlight of consciousness that if you think of the cacophony of networks in your brain that are volunteering different information over time, and ones that end up being in accord, that are shouting similar messages, similar concepts at similar time, that becomes what you're conscious of. So this all really works well together. You really are of many minds, and your minds are likely programmed with something like a multi-dimensional, many thousands of dimensions mathematically, latent space that stores these concepts, all shouting for attention. We've entered a realm of science fiction where we can do music synthesis. Was it Chopin, I think, died before he completed a symphony? He had the first two movements, and they fed his information about his compositions into a neural network and asked this neural network to make the missing third movement. And it did, and it was, who knows if it's what he would have done, but it's certainly stylistically consistent. Text generators like ChatGPT, image generators like I was talking about a moment ago, expert systems that, there's an expert system that they trained on images of breast cancer. And this expert system was able to identify breast cancer tumors earlier than any of the physicians in the study group were able to determine it. Amazing things. Artificial general intelligence. Some of you have heard of this notion of the Turing test, where you can sit down and have a conversation with a computer. If we're not there, we're really close. So, do we have a robotic, cybernetic future? Computers have already enhanced our quality of life. They've made it into our dishwashers and cars and televisions and phones and many other things. What will the future look like when we start using this technology more than just for research and novelty? Or are there risks? Certainly there are. Are we playing a game of chicken with AI? There's a robotic chicken I created an image of. And what about the distant future? One of the things I talked about in our humanist discussion group earlier this week was maybe the future of our species is not that our biological children will explore the stars, but maybe our technological children will explore the stars, carrying forward some of our concepts and knowledge and capabilities in a non-biological way. There's all kinds of ethical questions about that. We could explore different worlds, but not as ourselves, but as entities that we have manufactured. Next time when we meet, we'll talk about free will. Thank you for your attendance. If you're willing to stay a little while, I can take questions and comments. Yeah, Dave's adjusting the slider up there.
Well, just in the news recently, they were saying the AI, the biggest limitation with AI now is concerns of whether they just call it, mistakes or actually fantasy, because they're kind of AIs coming out with these, the text, the explanations like you had there. But when they're wrong,
They state their incorrect information with great confidence. The sky is green.
Exactly.
Right.
And so it's a
Thanks for
fantasy.
coming.
Yeah, thank you for coming, those of you who are leaving.
So it's a fantasy concern, and that doesn't seem like that hard a problem to address in AI, but that seems to be the big stymieing problem in AI. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's called, AI researchers call it hallucinating. Yeah, the notion that because ChatGPT, for example, is compelled or programmed to provide a response to every question you ask, if its training corpus did not include the correct answer to the question, it will still answer it, right? How many different kinds of photoreceptors are there in a mantis shrimp eye, right? For example, I don't know if it knows the answer to that, but that's an obscure thing. Maybe it'll say 20, maybe it'll say 417, right? And because they are programmed to respond to everything, they can respond with hallucinations, with information that is incorrect. And how do you separate the correct information from the incorrect information? How do you spot hallucinations? That's one of the things that people are worried about now and looking into. And I don't know that there's a good answer to it yet. All right.
I didn't understand the point you were making that a stimulus was given of, let's say, a certain person's image into someone's brain.
Uh-huh.
And then through some manipulation, that image came back out again, but I don't know where it came out, this person's description of it, or?
Yeah, thanks. So I kind of raced through that because of time constraints, but they put people into MRIs, these big machines that read the activity of different regions of your brain. And first of all, the resolution of those machines is really low compared to the size of neurons. So they cannot detect individual neurons or even small neural networks that are active. They can just detect sort of regions of the brain that have activity. So they put people in these MRI machines and showed them images. And they trained a neural network to create a latent space based upon the activity in the human brains as they were perceiving those visual stimuli. So they built a network that said, this is what a brain does when it sees Carol Burnett or Barack Obama. This is what a brain looks like that is seeing Barack Obama. And it built that into its latent model. And then in the future, they went back and they asked their test subjects to imagine Barack Obama without seeing a picture. And they had them in an MRI machine, and they translated the brain activity through this latent model that had been trained. And out the other side, it was translated into an image, just like text to image that I showed with the man in an umbrella. And out the other side came a picture noticeably like, for example, Barack Obama.
Out of the other side of the person's brain, or out of?
No, out of the computer. So an MRI reads the data, feeds it into a computer, and the computer interprets the MRI data and sends it kind of in the reverse order through this latent model. And the other side of that latent model is a picture. One way is a picture goes into the brain, which trains a latent model about what a brain does when exposed to that image. Well, you can go the other way. You can say, here's a brain, who knows what the heck it's doing? Let's send it backwards through that latent model and see if we can make sense of it. Oh yeah, that's an image of Barack Obama.
And then you said they can do it with llamas and?
Well, yeah, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a face. It
Okay.
can be.
I didn't know if they were
Yeah.
putting llamas in MRIs now or something.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
I'd be in favor of that.
Yeah, Scott, that MRI data is so interesting, and it's part of the same question that we're all trying to figure out how the brain works, and it seems like that's one aspect of it. But generally, exciting stuff you read now, like in firing rates of different neurons, is associated with these same types of things, and overall electrical activity of the brain, the waves, and modular basis of the brain, how they're all working together. So, Yeah, so the question is, how does that fit into kind of these general concepts that are being developed, how the brain works?
I think that's just, my shortcut for talking about all of that was networks of networks, right? So it's all relevant, but I just can't go into arbitrary detail about it. Yep.
Hi.
Hi.
So, for background information, psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia can onset into someone in about like their mid-20s to late 30s. Are you of the, that includes a lot of like personality changes, the way they see this world and stuff, and there's a lot of like stuff that can onset and happen. They can get stimulus of stuff that's not really there. Are you of the opinion now that in this day and age with training models like that, we can simulate brain simulations and be able to spot onset like occurrences that might be indicative of schizophrenia and stuff like that before it actually starts to onset on the mind?
Yeah. I did not think about that prior to your mentioning it, and I'm not a researcher, so I don't have my own laboratory. But I encourage you to go to graduate school and start some work in this. I mean, I think that if it can recognize brain or breast tumors, which is, you know, it's just matter and energy and flow, you know, everything is matter and energy and connections between them. And if it can spot a pathology of one sort, then perhaps it, very plausibly, I think, it could be trained to recognize other pathologies, including brain pathologies. All right, we got another question or comment?
Yeah, I think it was fascinating that generating the MRI into latent space and then coming out with an image that the person is imagining. It's like reading their mind.
Yes.
In a way, and it's almost like a MRI lie detector. You know, what are you
Yes.
thinking? We can read your mind.
Yeah,
Wow.
so several years ago, I read a science story that talked about MRI lie detectors. And according to what I had read at the time, whenever you're asked a question, your brain will first volunteer the correct response, but that response may not come out of your mouth, right? Like, where were you last night? I was out getting a pizza. Whereas the correct response was, I was seeing a mistress, right? Well, I was seeing a mistress happens in your brain prior to the confabulation of I was out getting a pizza, right? And so several years ago, there was talk about using MRIs to detect lies. And if you combine it with this technology where you can actually figure out which concepts are being represented, that's scary from an ethical, legal, invasion of privacy. There's a whole panoply of moral and ethical issues around this that must be sorted out. That's why a lot of scientists and researchers and others are calling for a pause on this AI development that has been happening at an exponential pace over the past couple of years.
There's this group that's trying to communicate with whales.
Yeah, SETI.
Yeah, it seems to me that a whale's model of the world is
Yes.
way different than ours. They ought to maybe work on monkeys. And there was this gorilla a long time ago that they taught sign language.
Coco, yeah.
Yeah, and you could communicate feelings with this animal. Seems like that'd be a place to start.
Yeah, I don't know why they chose whales. It may be because whales have a verbal language that is so different from ours or from monkeys, you know, for that matter. So I don't know why they chose whales, but I still think it's a wonderful research project.
Of course, on Facebook, you can find an awful lot of stuff with dogs and cats especially, where there are buttons which you put on the floor or anything else, and it's got a word or a short
Concept,
phrase,
yeah.
and you communicate completely with your cat or your dog, and they will form complete sentences and total thoughts, and they'll tell you exactly what they think, whether you like it or not.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you all for showing up today. I hope you come back next month. Again, on what, do you know the day?
I believe, is it May 5th?
May 5th, James will be talking to us about human self-selection and domestication. And then whatever the third Sunday is, I'll wrap this up by talking about free will, a tiny little non-contentious topic. Yeah. All right, thank you all. See you next time.